Signing up.
All right, we're going to go ahead and get started so we can stay on time today. So I know we have a few committee members who are still making their way in, but we're going to go ahead and get started this morning. First and foremost, I want to just say good morning. Welcome to the Economic Development and Tourism Committee meeting today. And before we get too far gone, Mayor, would you be willing to open us up in a word of prayer this morning?
Sure.
All right.
You're 23.
23.
Thank you. Let me pull my glasses. Heavenly Father, thank you for bringing us together this morning. We hope that as we sit in this room and listen to the various speakers, that we will be able to make very sound decisions for our communities. Put the words in our mouth that are going to carry us over, that is going to make sure that we are looking out not only for the state of Georgia, but for our own communities. I ask this prayer in the name of our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. Amen.
Amen.
Amen. Thank you. Thank you. All right. So we have House Bill 1329 in front of us. We're working off of LC 365799S today. This is Chairman Stevens' bill. And I'm going to, at this time, well, before I turn it over to him, we had a sign-up sheet. We have a few folks signed up to speak. And I would just ask each of the folks that have signed up that you would be concise in your comments, and please try to avoid repeating the same thing over and over. If you have a unique point to make, we certainly welcome that. But we definitely want to stay on track here. So, Chairman Stevens, at this time, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, members of the committee, Mr. Chairman. Starting off.
Don't give me that promotion.
Wouldn't do that this morning. Before you have House Bill 1329, which is the Georgia Fantasy Sports Consumer Protection Act. As Georgia takes a step to define what this particular sport is, it's important that fantasy sports not be left behind, and thus I bring you House Bill 1329. Fantasy Sports Consumer Protection Act addresses three key issues: consumer protection, state revenue to the Georgia Lottery, and championing local business. Ladies and gentlemen, more than 250,000 Georgians entered the daily fantasy sports in 2023. As of 2022, the total number of U.S. fantasy sports players eclipsed 50 million. Fantasy sports consumers deserve the same protection and considerations offered to other sports wagering patrons, which, by the way, today is not legal. 1329 will allow for robust, responsible gaming resources and protection for fantasy contest consumers, as well as marketing restrictions and integrity protections akin to other sports wagering. Ladies and gentlemen, this is a game of skill. Further, this will give the Georgia Lottery Corporation oversight over fantasy contest operators and will hold them accountable and require them to ensure and protect the consumer funds. Fantasy sports is a massive industry located in Georgia. Some of the companies housed and home here in Georgia is a massive industry. It's a footnote in sports wagering bill that does deserve to be hundreds of thousands of Georgians, and they enjoy this contest every day. State revenues, 1329 proposes licensing fees and tax rates based on the gross revenues operated under this scheme. The first licensing fees will generate $8 million to the state, creating parity with the sports betting licensing structure, which of course is passed out of the Senate committee. The tax rate will be 20%, which is exactly the rate for sports betting. The licensing fee is $1 million and will generate $40 million in annual revenues. Ladies and gentlemen, that essentially is what the bill does. They're operating today in Georgia. This will capture the revenues. It will regulate what is going on today, and it will go into HOPE scholarships and pre-K funding. Mr. Speaker, I did it again. Mr. Chairman, if you don't mind, I will. I can either go through the bill or I'll take questions on the bill, whichever you prefer.
I think maybe if you would like to just highlight a few things in the bill, that would be good. If the committee members maybe hear a little more explanation, and then we've got a few questions. Number 12. Is that? Oh, Representative Burnell.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning.
Morning.
You said that the funds will go to pre-K. Clayton County is in the process. We're going to build, I think it's 3 or 4 new early learning centers for pre-K. So would that money go to them?
It goes to the lottery, and of course that's split out to the HOPE Scholarship and pre-K. Currently, we do not fully fund pre-K. There's this conception that we do. This would help plug the gap to funding pre-K and make it statewide.
To fully fund?
To fully fund, this won't fund it all, but it'll plug the hole.
Okay, thank you.
It's about $45 to $50 million.
Representative Franklin, I'm sorry.
Thank you. You said we're going to get 20%. Is that correct? Can you explain a little bit about that? Because I have no idea the percentages of how that works. I mean, where'd that come from? And
Sure. In previous bills, we've talked about the formula. Essentially, what you've got is the gross revenue minus the tax that's the federal excise tax paid out, and that revenue is so that there's no games played, no pun intended. That your gross revenue minus the payouts is your adjusted gross revenue, so that the amount that comes back to the state of Georgia is a true amount of the revenues played. In the past, we've had situations where in the bills they would have other games that they could deduct off of what came back to the Georgia lottery. This is a pure number minus their excise tax paid that comes to the Georgia lottery. So there's nothing that can be done that a shell game, if you will, so that we're not getting the revenue we need.
All right, Chairman Bonner.
Hey, thank you, Chairman Steve. Just a few questions. What is the age demographic that typically participates in this activity?
We don't allow teenagers in the bill. As you might, whenever you check the bill, you'll see that our age limitation's 19. We don't need kids playing this fantasy sports, so 19 and above is the age limit for that.
Well, I understand what's in the bill, but in terms of the practicality, I mean, is this something like nationwide? It's like a 18 to 25 age range.
Yes.
Would that be and for the most part, folks typically older than that, maybe not so much.
That's true.
Okay. And then just kind of looking through the bill itself, I do see, and I appreciate that there are some penalties in there for organizations that would target folks under 19. The penalties, in my mind, seem fairly low for violating the statute that's proposed. Especially given the number of folks that we expect to participate, I think the fines cap out for, I believe is how it's stated in here. But just curious as to know who set those limits. Because the way I read it, it's like a not to exceed 25,000, and then I think a 50,000 aggregate, if I'm reading that correctly.
Which is 25,000 or 50,000 more than we're collecting today on penalties.
Which for an activity that's currently illegal, understand. But we're wanting to make it legal. But we want to make it legal, but we want to say you can't offer it to anybody under 19 or violate these statutes. But it just seems to me that the penalty for violating these statutes seem fairly low.
In relation to the amount of revenue that we take in, the penalties is stiff. Again, these games are in Georgia. They're being played today in Georgia by folks in Georgia. So these penalties, I believe, are pretty stiff at $25,000 a clip, and they progressively go up.
They do go up, or they cap at 50.
What line are you on?
Oh, I'm trying to find that. Looks like page 22.
I'm looking at page 23, where any person violates the provision shall be liable for civil penalty not to exceed $50,000.
Out of the same transaction or occurrence.
Yes.
Okay. And then just last question, Mr. Chairman. The anticipation is that revenue would go to Lottery Corporation for the purpose of funding pre-K. Is that
For the purpose of the current Georgia Lottery currently funds Hope and pre-K.
Understand. Okay. Those are my questions. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
All right, Representative Jackson.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, one of the things that I'm always concerned about are our higher education institutions, and you and I have had this discussion. Is there any way, I know pre-K is definitely important. We have to do more and more and more about pre-K. But in here, and I have not read it all, is it spelled out is when you're talking about the Hope Scholarship, how that money is going to be distributed. The other thing was, through the years, when what was his name? Zell Miller started the Hope Scholarship, it was so good that so many students, but then they kept changing the rules, and less students became eligible for the Hope Scholarship. Have you given any consideration of kind of cleaning up some of that, or would that be left to the Higher Education Committee?
That should be left to the Higher Education Committee. There is a needs-based piece already built into the Hope Scholarship, and it's a pretty significant amount. So that we decided not to touch that at this point. And again, this is a very small amount that's going to plug some of the holes. So very good question, though.
Thank you.
All right, Representative Evans.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So can you describe for me what the difference is between fantasy sports and sports betting?
Very easily, fantasy sports, there are no teams, no games that are actually played, and that probably is the biggest difference. Sports betting, of course, is a game of chance. This is a game of skill, just like you would see checkers, chess, that kind of stuff.
And who's opposed to this? Who's opposed to this legislation for fantasy sports?
I can't think of anybody because the games are going on today. We're only capturing the revenue and sending that to the lottery.
May I ask a further question? But isn't that true? That's what we hear about sports betting as well, that those games are going on today as well.
If sports betting is going on today, it's illegal because that is a game of chance. Now the Senate has they have a bill over there that deals with sports betting. This does not.
But fantasy sports that's being played today is legal. And what is in this bill is that what you're saying? It is legal, but now this is adding structure to what happens to the revenue.
We've had an opinion by an attorney general that it is not years ago, but no one's challenged that. So they continue to play. So again, all we're trying to do is capture what's going on today in the state of Georgia by Georgians and Georgia companies.
Okay, thank you.
Representative Byrd.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for your presentation. Could you explain to me how someone under whatever a minor is considered these days would not be able to do this gambling?
You're set up whenever you qualify to play these games, you have to set up an identity, if you will, for for games within the companies and the operators. And the operators, of course, have penalties as well if somebody under the age of 19 plays a game. So there's not only a penalty for the player, but also penalties for the operator.
So could we further elaborate on that, please? So, all right, I'm 16 years old. My parents have given me a phone. Can I fake my identity to say that I'm older than 16 years old?
You know what? That question probably needs to come to the operators, and the operators are going to speak next. That's a perfect question for them.
Thank you.
All right, Representative Williams.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for your presentation, Mr. Chairman. I might have missed it when you were giving it. Is there an approximate on how much fantasy sports betting is being done now? And if this bill passes, what will it do, or what will happen to those folks who might go offshore still, or can they? How do we capture the monies that you're talking about?
It actually gives some stability, if you will. That's a very good question. 250,000 Georgians played fantasy sports last year. That's significant. They'll still be able to go offshore if they want to, but if I'm a player, I'm hoping that the lottery will give stability to the game so that there's just stability. Just as you do whenever you get a lottery ticket today, you're probably not going to win, but at least you know that it's being run fairly.
Representative Burnell. Oh, okay. All right. Do we have any other questions? All right.
Thank you, Chairman, for carrying this bill. This is definitely, I can agree with you, it's a game of skill, not chance at all. I play on the ESPN app. Me and my brothers have done it for years now. And one of my brothers, he wins almost every single year. He pulls up the stats of the running backs, and he knows these are injured, these, so many yards a carry, the quarterback, and he wins year after year. And it's like, no, it's skill. He goes, does his research, and it's a fun game. And I definitely think we know people are playing this, and so to be able to grab the revenue, I like the bill. I mean, it makes sense, and it's not a game of chance, because anybody who has played it knows its skill. So thank you. And I know also all ages, not just 18 to 25. It goes all the way to 80, 85. They're all playing it.
Thank you, T, for your question. Tennessee has, of course, has made this their controlling and has made it into law. Also, our neighboring state of Alabama, they don't even have a lottery, but they do fantasy sports. And Mr. Chairman, if I may, and I know we've got some speakers that want to get to us. In 1992, whenever the lottery was invented, these things were not invented back then. So all that we're asking to do is to make fantasy sports, to capture the revenue, and make this electronic ticket, if you will, legal and most importantly regulated by our Georgia State Lottery.
All right, so at this time, we did have a few speakers signed up on this bill. I want to start with Stuart Wilkinson from Prize Picks. If you'll come forward to the podium and you go right ahead.
Well, thank you, Mr. Vice Chairman. My name is Stuart Wilkinson. I am the Director of Government Affairs with Prize Picks. With me is Josh Kirshner. He is our legal counsel. So I just want to quickly address some of the questions, but real quick background on Prize Picks. We are a Georgia-grown company employing over 200 people. We're seeing that number grow each and every single day, located right here in Midtown Atlanta. We're the #1 fastest daily fantasy sports operator in North America. Representative Evans, you asked about what are the differences between online sports betting and daily fantasy sports. Well, there are 5 key components. The first is that a user must submit an entry fee. The second is that the team that you're selecting is based off of individual athletes who are on different teams. The third is that you are selecting this based off of fantasy projections. That is the game of skill component. What Representative Clark was talking about earlier about running backs and knowing the different athletes, that is the game of skill component, knowing how to successfully craft these individuals. The fourth is that financial transparency. You know what the prize is at the time of submitting your entry. And the fifth and final component to this is that no individual athlete, no individual team, or no individual sporting event outcome can affect your daily fantasy score. So those are the 5 key differences with daily fantasy sports and online sports betting. Representative Byrd, you asked about protection with minors. We have world-class know your customer safety protocols in place. Josh will be able to dive into that a little bit deeper. We're excited to be here to talk about this bill. Representative Stevens has done a fantastic job talking about the economic development impact. We see anywhere between $40 to $60 million that can be added to Hope and pre-K. What's special about that is our CEO, Adam Wexler, went to the University of Georgia on the Hope Scholarship. That's how he was able to get there. And he has become a successful entrepreneur and has chosen to stay in Georgia. And it's very important to him that we continue funding the Hope Scholarship to provide these opportunities for further Georgians. Yeah, little slip, sorry, early. But we appreciate you guys being here this morning. And I'll kick things over to Josh Kirshner. Thank you, guys.
Thank you, Stuart. That was a smart way to butter up your boss, actually. I think that was good thinking. So the first thing I want to address is Chairman Bonner, your comments before. What I would point out first in the sections that you point to is those caps are per occurrence. And so I believe in the way the bill's written and the way that the chairman intended the bill is if you have a minor who makes 5 different entries, that would be 5 occurrences. So we're no longer talking about a cap of $50,000. We're now talking about $250,000. In addition to those civil penalties, keep in mind, the regulator, or the GLC in this case, absolutely has the ability to suspend, revoke, review a license. So when you talk about this, I would encourage you to take a broader view than just what could be a slap on the wrist depending on the size of your company. You're talking about the livelihood and licensure of your company in this state. The other thing I will say is there's private costs. Those private costs can look a few different ways. One, you need payment processors. You need financial institutions in order to successfully operate a fantasy sports contest, right? I think you ask any operator, they will say the lifeblood of their contest is allowing their customers to easily and safely deposit funds and withdraw funds. If you are allowing a ton of minors or otherwise those who are restricted from playing your games onto your platform, your financial institutions will no longer work with you because you'll suddenly see an uptick in chargebacks. You'll see, that kid's parents maybe say, no, give this money back. And you'll face a situation where your financial partners will say, we're not going to work with you. Representative Byrd, I think that also goes well to your point. It is not as simple in today's day and age on these platforms, one, because of this bill, because of the regulation, and because of the legislation and language of this bill. You cannot have a situation, you will not receive a license if all you say is, well, we hope everyone is telling the truth when they sign up. It is a lot more than that. It is not only this robust KYC protocol, but you can't simply list your birthday as being in 1947 if you're 16 years old. You have to provide identification. You have to provide proof of age, proof of identity, and all the rest, not only to protect against minors playing on these platforms, but to protect against identity theft, to protect against fraud, to protect against money laundering, and on, like most regulated industries. The other thing that I think is probably important to briefly touch on that Chairman Stevens touched on before is the 2016 memo from Attorney General Olens' office that goes to the differentiation between sports betting and daily fantasy sports in Georgia. Again, as the chairman so eloquently stated, daily fantasy sports is not only occurring today, but it's occurring legally within the state. These are games of skill. The state of Georgia recognizes under common law the legality of games of skill. And while I appreciate that the 2016 memo took a position that Georgia is what's called an any chance state, that position has been belied by the authorities relied on in that memo. That memo cites extensively and repeatedly to attorneys general's opinions in Illinois and Mississippi, amongst other states. Those states have since passed either legislation legalizing fantasy sports, or in the case of Illinois, once he was sued by FanDuel on that opinion, he came out and said, we want this case to be dismissed. This is actually an advisory opinion that I don't plan on enforcing. Likewise, in Georgia, there has been no enforcement. And I would say between 2016 and today across the nation, thought has significantly evolved on this topic. There's been more studies, more empirical evidence, more review that this is now a legal game of skill. And where I will leave things is this. This game is occurring today in Georgia. This is not the sports betting argument of, well, it's happening illegally, we should make it legal. This is happening legally, and what operators are looking for is clarity. They're looking for this legislative body to take its authority and provide them with clarity, protection for consumers, and also a chance for the state to capture that revenue. I appreciate Chairman Stevens for being a champion of this, and I appreciate your time.
Thank you. You have a few questions if you'll stay right there. I'm going to go to Chairman Bonner.
Hey, thank you for that presentation.
Yes,
I
sir.
appreciate that. Could you just very briefly just kind of quantify this for us on the front end? Like what's a typical bet? What's a typical payout? Things like that. How and if you're able to quantify, at least on your platform, how many, and I'll just call them customers, how many recurring customers you have during the course of a year?
Sure. Well, and as y'all can see, brevity is obviously my strong suit here. So
Yeah, keep it brief, brother.
that won't be an issue. Very briefly, at least in terms of my client Prize Picks, you see everything from $5 to $100 and upwards. I don't want to commit to a specific number, but I would say the average entry fee is much closer to that $5 because you're just looking for entertainment 9 times out of 10. You're looking for something more while you're sitting there watching the game. Overall, I could tell you that Prize Picks, I was a former employee, I should say, has in excess of 100,000 customers in the state in 2023 alone. And that's one company that doesn't consider FanDuel or DraftKings or Underdog or Sleeper or on. When the chairman says 250,000 customers last year, I really want that number to sink in. 250,000 people playing daily fantasy sports in the state without consumer protection right now.
All right, Representative Burnell.
Thank you again, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for giving us all that information. I'm from Detroit originally, so I don't really have anything against gambling, but I do have some concerns because you keep saying that it's a game of skill. At the end of the day, it's still gambling, right?
I would say there's 2 answers, if I can. Under law, where, I want to be as careful as possible with my language, no, it is not gambling. But what it is, and where I don't want to mislead anyone, is this is real money gaming. This is still people taking their hard-earned money and putting it into players and sporting events. And the point I'll make, and I apologize for cutting you off in the middle, is this bill, I think, has very good, very robust, responsible play, problem gaming protections, self-exclusion, education. And what I would encourage this committee to consider is taking some of the revenue generation, just a portion of it, and making sure it goes towards funding that programming, whether it's through GLC, whether it's through DBHDD. I absolutely agree with where I think you're going on this, that there needs to be fences in place. There needs to be protections if we're talking about real money gaming.
Okay, that's not exactly where I'm going, but it is gambling and people can lose their livelihood. My problem with it is that we keep talking about that it's going to go to Hope and it's going to go to pre-K. Hope was really good when it first started, as one of my colleagues said, but they kept changing the rules. So those individual working people who were playing the lottery and all that stuff, their children didn't get to use Hope. What happened with them was that they didn't get the benefits of it because they kept changing the rules. And so if you keep changing the rules, the people that are playing, because your person over there that said he went to University of Georgia, his parents probably could pay for him to go to college, just like my parents paid for me to go. But I am more concerned about pre-K because that's a different animal for me because we're trying to build those centers. So that's why I can go either way on your bill, but my problem is, will my community and the people who are playing these games, these working people, are their children going to benefit? And if their children are not going to benefit, then that's where I can't support it. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Representative Williams.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Very quickly, I was listening, and I think I might have missed, if you addressed it, a consumer protection part. I'm interested in someone who places it, decides that's not what I really want to do, and wants to withdraw their bet. In this state, I got a little bill dealing with peer-to-peer, Cash App, PayPal, all those. The banking community won't even talk about it. They just got your money, and they don't care. They play third party. You can't even get a decent answer about money. And they're one of the cash cows, but they're a prize cash cow. Our consumers going to have protection because banks don't care. They just sit there as a depositor.
Very briefly, first of all, I appreciate that bill. Who among us has not accidentally pressed send when they meant to press receive on Venmo before? To your point, these games are consumer facing. Like I said before, the lifeblood of these games is the ability to easily and in a trustworthy way deposit and withdraw funds. And so in the case of I can't speak for every single consumer. I can certainly say that the bill directs and allows the corporation to make exact rules about that. And I don't think you would receive pushback at all. And certainly most of the operators now in this space say, if you made an entry and your game has not started yet and you said, I accidentally, chose player X instead of player Y, or I pressed $50 instead of $25, you can cancel your entry at any time before your game starts. You shouldn't be penalized for the slip of a finger.
Quickly, Mr. Chairman, if I could. I'm asking questions because I know Representative Jackson and maybe a few others of you. I have no earthly idea usually what you're talking about. I've never heard of most of the companies you mentioned, and to be very honest with you, only one of your lobbyists, young lady in here, has ever even talked to me, so I don't know anything about you all now. Rubber meeting the road, it's sure good to see you.
I don't hear that often, so I appreciate it, Representative.
All right. Two more questions. Representative Neal.
Thank you. Thank you to the chair. Thank you to the other chair for presenting the bill. So, yes, I have a few questions, and some of it leans on what my colleague, Representative Bernot, mentioned, and I want to establish what we're actually doing with this bill. So I know we have some enabling legislation moving elsewhere in the form of a constitutional amendment to allow for sports betting in general. So my follow-up to that would be the intention of this bill. Is this bill to the creation of or allowing for fantasy sports itself in isolation? Or is this bill also an opportunity for it to be a vessel for us to ensure that we add additional benefits to students of this state as well? For instance, would this be the vessel for us to outline explicitly that we are going to include minority participation or what have you? Is this the vessel for that? And if so, I would like to offer a friendly amendment or two, and I know my colleagues would like to add something as well.
Sure. So, first of all, I ultimately defer to the bill sponsor and the chairman, obviously, with this being his bill. Speaking on behalf of my client, and I like to think the industry is at large, is the industry welcomes additional legislation or requirements related to minority participation. The industry certainly recognizes historical disadvantages, certainly recognizes the need for language and in general equity and parity in those areas. But again, at the end of the day, I ultimately need to defer to the bill sponsor and the chairman.
Okay. Representative Gladney.
Yes, sir. Thank you,
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Vice Chairman, for the bill and giving me the opportunity to ask this question. And it may have been answered, forgive my tardiness as well. You had indicated over 250,000 Georgians already participate in sports betting as it is right now. Is that correct?
Fantasy sports.
Fantasy sports, okay. And so as they participate right now, when they play the game, are they at least paying Georgia taxes on their contribution at all? Or they're paying taxes to the state that they're the state that they're playing in? So we're getting no contribution at all for this, is that correct?
With the caveat that I'm far from a tax attorney, I do not believe that they are. You know, there's certain federal taxes that you are required to pay, but from a state perspective, I do not believe the state is currently reaping any benefits from this otherwise legal game.
Okay, thank you.
All right, so here's our posture, and thank you for your comments today. We have several other speakers lined up that I want to get to, and I'm going to move next to Professor Dr. John Kent from my district, Cartersville. Dr. Kent, welcome today, and I'm going to allow you to share briefly.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, may I put my materials down here and testify from here, which will go faster?
You can. The podium is fine if that's what you prefer. But if you've got a lot of information there, you come sit at the table. That's fine as well. We'll turn that mic on.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. Appreciate your courtesy. I think most of you have this. I should start off by saying I've been a professor for teaching for over 40 years, law, business, and economics. My colleagues and I do not accept any honoraria for talking about gambling issues. We have frequently testified under oath before the National Gambling Impact Study Commission, before the Congress as expert witnesses, and we are not using talking points, which I hear over and over again from the gambling industry. And they are not usually speaking under oath, but our numbers are accurate, and if they're inaccurate, we're in trouble. So I think most of you have a copy of Newsweek it's from 10 years ago, and you can see the national media gets it. If you need more copies of this, come down here and look at them. And right at the top, it says we're now up to 5 to 11% of kids and teens are now addicted or problem gamblers. Now, why is that? Well, one major reason is because if you're looking for drugs, you have to go across the street and find a pusher. But if you want to gamble, you can take this 24/7, click your mouse, lose your house. You can lose your tots to online slots. And on the front page of this Newsweek article, the national media gets it. On the front page of this, you'll see a citation, a link to 60 Minutes. 2 weeks ago, 60 Minutes did an expose on this and literally savaged sports gambling, DraftKings, FanDuel. DraftKings wouldn't even show up for the interview with 60 Minutes. Take a look at the link on this. CNN has done a big thing on this recently. And if you look down the side here, you'll see big gambling has finally been forced to admit sex trafficking problems. Here's a copy of their press release. You've seen the film, I hope, Sound of Freedom. They can't hide it anymore. They're doing big reports saying, well, we'll self-regulate on this. So from a national perspective, there are these problems. And I think my law colleagues will totally disagree with the legal presentation that was given here today about the Attorney General's opinion here involving gambling in Georgia. So I refer you to that. And I would also refer you to the Illinois Law Review, which many of you have seen, which has 14 blue ribbon academics, nonpartisan. They say none of this is working. And most recently, a red flag report out of Emory Law School, another Law Review article, saying that we are violating our consumer protection by pushing this. And my question, or question of my colleagues and myself to you all, is kids are studying drug addiction and other problems in school. Why isn't gambling addiction there? Gambling addiction is a recognized addiction similar to crack cocaine addiction pursuant to the American Psychiatric Association and the medical communities and health communities throughout the country. You have your own out of Savannah, Moms Against Gambling just formed with Jeannie Seaver running that. My colleagues at Emory and law colleagues, big tech. Have you not watched the hearings recently with Marsha Blackburn and Senator Blumenthal out of Connecticut on big tech and big gambling and how they're rolling over? There are multiple bills in Congress right now to restrict exactly what you're trying to do here today, or what the industry is trying to do here today. They're making this a fast track push because they know that nationally they're in trouble. They're in trouble with 60 Minutes. They're in trouble with CNN. They're in trouble with the New York Times, which just did a whole series of articles against sports gambling, daily fantasy sports. Washington Post, the Chicago Tribune, front page. Now, you've heard references to good old Illinois. The Chicago Tribune, front page, after they legalized sports gambling. Then this is from the Illinois Department of Human Services. They had 383,000 new addicted gamblers hooked on this sports gambling, 761,000 new problem gamblers, costing the state in billions of dollars. That's what are the costs? New addicted gamblers, new bankruptcies, new crime and corruption, suicides, child abuse, spousal abuse. Everything gets worse with gambling. The only people who benefit are the owners of the gambling. Now, I know, and last thing here, a Wall Street Journal last year on Super Bowl weekend indicated, and I'm quoting the Wall Street Journal now, quote, the delays in betting mean that sports books are one or two plays ahead of millions of viewers, end quote. So streaming sports gamblers are, quote, dead in the water, end quote. Now, this is the Wall Street Journal saying millions of people are being cheated with all of this. This is the Wall Street Journal, not yours truly. And when they talk about reports and documentation, we've got the National Gambling Impact Study Commission, a 4 or 5 year long commission out of the Congress. And they said, do not do this. Do not legalize this online gambling. This is a collection of hundreds of reports from academia, economics, government reports. None of what you are being presented here today by the industry is totally accurate. They're great talking points, but they are not accurate. You're going down a rabbit's hole. This is going to make everything worse. We've done the research. This is just one of 6 volumes, hundreds of reports. For every $1 they bring in, the cost to the taxpayers are $3 to $12. That's academic. 98 to 99% of academics will agree with what I say. We don't take any honorarium for this. This is pure academics. We've got this research out of here that I mentioned before, the Illinois Law Review. This includes researchers from University of Georgia, Emory. We've got reports out of Mercer. They're all on board. This is the wrong way to go. So thank you for your time and consideration. If there are any quick questions, I'll be glad to take them.
Thank you. You do not have any at this time. Thank you, Dr. Kent. So at this point, and I know that we have several members that have to get to more committee meetings here shortly. Mr. Chairman, I would be happy to, I know the question was posed a minute ago about amendments to your bill. I know that there is a little bit of a time issue here for trying to do that at this point. So I would ask you, Chairman, if you would address whether you would be open to amendments to your bill at this point.
Absolutely. Mr. Chairman, I'll this is a good point to be open to amendments. And let's be clear. The only thing that we're doing here with this bill today is we're talking about regulating and taxing 250,000 folks that have played the game last year. So we're not adding something new. We just need to capture the revenue so that we can fund Hope and pre-K. Finally, fully fund Hope and pre-K. At least work towards that end. But others need to speak, I'm sure. But this is a good time for those that want to add amendments. Yes, sir.
Okay. Representative Neal.
Yes, so one point, I want to have a point of clarification. So when I asked the question earlier, just for the purpose of the body, and said, is this the vessel for adding the other ways the monies can be dispersed, such as, needs-based, all that kind of stuff? This is not the vessel for that. We have to do that in the constitutional amendment.
That is correct.
Part 2. If I do have an amendment, it will be in the sections between 223 to 228. Probably 223 subsection B, something to, actually that's not going to work. It will have to be inserting, let me tell you what I'm trying to do, and then legislative council can advise. A lot of minorities are not, they don't have the businesses established. Some at the same rate as other minorities, as other races in these spaces. And so what I want to add is something that allows for, like in the 223 section, it talks about training or something related to games. And I want to add something that says that some type of training will be established or provided to like the technical colleges of Georgia to allow for students to learn this space so they can create the businesses themselves and then become a part of the different types of gaming that they're probably not, they're not privy to because they don't have the training, the access, or the exposure. So something related to this entity allowing for some type of course or coursework at the technical colleges of Georgia.
So is that in the form of amendment?
In the form of an amendment.
That's kind of the posture we're in at this point.
Okay, yeah, so
we
in
need
the-
to be
in the-
real specific
Yeah, so
if you're
in the
planning to amend this
section-
bill in committee here.
If legislative council can advise, I'm thinking it's in the section around the lines 223. Or I might need to add, we might need to just add another section altogether. And it can be a one-liner, just something short and sweet, but some type of course provided to the technical colleges of Georgia TCSG via the business programming. That intros.
All right, Representative Neal, I think what would be good to do, since we have a lot of questions and a lot of people that are still lined up to speak, is work on your amendment, and we will come back and vote on this at a later point, coordinating with Chairman Stevens, so that the members that do need to get to rules at 9 o'clock can do that. I see there's a lot of interest in this bill and a lot of folks that may have a idea that they want to include, and Chairman has certainly indicated his willingness to work with you on that. So at this point, I'm going to go back to our speakers that came today, and I'm going to call up, and then any of you that have to leave, I certainly understand. We will be here and continue to hear from our speakers. But if you have an amendment, let's get with Ledge Council, work on that, and then come back when we schedule the meeting, have that ready to go so that we don't have to do that live time here in committee. Y'all know that's a very onerous process, and we'd want to try to avoid that if we can avoid that. So at this time, I'm going to call Mike Griffin from the Georgia Baptist to the podium to speak.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I am Mike Griffin. I'm the Public Affairs Representative with Georgia Baptist Mission Board, and I've been dealing with this issue for a long time. As many of you know, this is my 17th year down here at the Capitol, And I testified against daily fantasy sports twice. They were introducing legislation 2016 and 17. How many of you were here then? So many of you probably were not even here. And they were trying to, and I say this respectfully, slip this in because they're already doing it. And then you had, when Sam Owens was Attorney General, you had a letter from their office that literally answered this question. It says, you have asked for advice on whether daily fantasy sports games are illegal under Georgia law. And they gave an analysis of it, and the conclusion from the Attorney General's office was that it is illegal. It is not a legal game in the state of Georgia. The second question had to do with whether or not actual contestant exclusion applies here. And it just basically says, no, this is not. Based under Georgia law, it's not. So I can give you 4 very quick reasons why it's not a game of skill. Number one, daily fantasy sports is not a game of skill because it fits the classic definition of gambling according to our laws. It's amazing. In 2017, the Richmond Times put out an article where baseball players were suspended because they played daily fantasy sports because it was seen as gambling according to the NCAA. Daily fantasy sports is not a game of skill just because it may require some skill. Skill and chance are mutually exclusive, and just as betting on a horse can involve skill, but outcome remains uncertain, and a bet that one horse will win is still a gamble. No one seriously argues horse racing is not gambling, despite the fact that the element of skill may be present. In daily fantasy sports, you're not picking horses, you're picking players with uncertain outcomes. Number 3, daily fantasy sports is not a game of skill because it's not the player who determines the outcome. In other words, it's intellectual dishonesty to suggest that a golf tournament or a bass fishing tournament is the same thing as daily fantasy sports. In a golf tournament, it's your skill from hole 1 to hole 18. And bass fishing tournament, it's your skill from 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. In addition, how many of you have ever heard Bass Fishing Anonymous? However, Gambling Anonymous has added daily fantasy sports to its list of activities as gambling. And then fourthly, daily fantasy sports is not a game of skill because it depends on players who have to believe they are gambling. In other words, even if you were to argue that a more experienced daily fantasy sports player does not see himself as gambling, then it would also be true that a lesser experienced player must be gambling. The very existence of experienced daily fantasy sports players playing with an edge and for a profit depends on the presence of lesser experienced players willing to gamble at a disadvantage against the experienced players. You can't have a more successful daily fantasy sports player without a compensating gambler, nationally known as suckers. You've got to have them there. You're not going to make the money. And so, again, it's kind of weird here that this is, well, we're already doing it, we just want to make it legal. Well, if you're already doing it, why do you need it legal? You say it's already legal. All we're going to be doing, I believe, on all these things that we constantly deal with is pouring gasoline on a fire rather than water that's already happening. And again, I've got an article come from a Democrat in the House about how the sports betting industry in Europe, that this thing of putting regulations and controlling it is basically a placebo. Because, again, the data shows that it's the problem in addicted gamblers. Even in Europe, up to 60% of the income comes from those problem gamblers. And again, this is seen as gambling. Thank you, Mr.
Thank you. Next, we have Taylor Hawkins. If you'll come up and be brief, because we've got several folks we got to get to.
Absolutely, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for the privilege of addressing you, and thank you, committee members, for your time this morning. I am Taylor Hawkins with Frontline Policy Action. Our organization represents family and Christian values here in the state. And with respect to this piece of legislation, we do see this as an expansion of gambling. We think it fits just about every classic definition of gambling, as has been already mentioned, but we also rely on the IRS's ruling twice in 2020 that all daily fantasy sports bets are classified as gambling transactions. So we think that is pretty crystal clear there. We also know that in 2022, 81% of those who participated in daily fantasy sports lost a significant amount of money. I believe that's classified as anything over $50. So, but a relatively significant amount of money, and that is up from just 60% about 5 years prior. So the amount. And to state another fact on that point, between 2004 and 2018, fantasy sports betting quadrupled in the United States. So I understand that a majority of those who participate in this, same with other forms of betting on sports and sports outcomes, are responsible gamblers. That's not the business model, Mr. Chairman. That's not where these companies are able to profit. They make a large portion of their profits off of problem gamblers. And there are many studies I could provide to this committee that show that an increase in participation with daily fantasy sports also leads to a higher likelihood of becoming a problem gambler. So while we understand there's some nuance in law, I also agree with Mike Griffin and what he mentioned about, our organization does, I should say, what he mentioned about the Attorney General's opinion. Understand there's some cloud around that, but I do think it's questionable at best, legally speaking. Studies have shown that online gambling has an outsized impact on young men, on poor families, on minority communities, and our organization stands strongly against any expansion of gambling for that reason. That being said, if this committee does choose to pass this legislation, I have two very quick things I'd like to mention. We would be in favor of further protections for those who may be in the situation of being a problem gambler. One of those is a suggested cool-off period, if that would be accepted as a possible amendment, just to require that someone can't. Problem gamblers that I've talked to personally say that the hardest thing is that they can download, they can accept their paycheck and immediately cash out their entire paycheck into an app and gamble it away in a matter of moments. So a cool-off period, I think, would be a very healthy thing to prevent problem gamblers from losing their entire paycheck for their family in just a day or two. Also, a second would be an absolute cap on the amount that a participant could lose in a day as a percentage of the money in their account. Whatever that might be, whether that's 30%, 50%. Those are just two ideas we have. Of course, again, we are opposed to this legislation, but if it passes, we would urge this committee to consider more strengthening the provisions that would prevent problem gamblers from losing their life savings or from losing their ability to provide for their family, which we think has a detrimental impact on families in our state. So with that, thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the opportunity to testify.
Thank you. Mac Parnell, Faith and Freedom, and then we have two more speakers left, so we need to wrap this up. I know we're losing folks. Mac.
I was just told Citizen Impact would like to be mentioned that they are opposed to this, Mr. Paul Smith as well. My name is Mac Parnell. I'm the Executive Director of the Georgia Faith and Freedom Coalition. We're opposed to the expansion of gambling in this state. You'll see a letter voicing some of our concerns. Thank you to the Chairman Stevens for your thoughtful approach on this. We are opposed to it, but we do appreciate your thoughtful approach. God bless y'all. Thank you.
Thank you. Tom Lee from Underdog Fantasy. Tom.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members. My name is Tom Lee. I'm an attorney from Nashville, though it is good to be home in some ways as a student at the University of Georgia in the halcyon days of the 1970s and 1980s. It is good to be in a place where one can say "Go Dogs" one more time. I also want to say that to the question or the issue that Representative Clark raised a moment ago about persons of all ages, I have finally figured out why I'm here. I am that person of all ages. I began playing what we used to call rotisserie baseball in the 1980s, and I've played fantasy sports for 40 years as counsel for Underdog Fantasy and as a former member of the Tennessee Sports Wagering Council. I can tell you that what you're doing is important work. It's important not just because of the discussion you're having about the differences and the nuances between fantasy sports and gaming. It's important because you have citizens in your state who need you to act responsibly. They need you to make sure that the persons who engage in this activity are responsible companies. You frankly don't have that protection right now. You do have responsible companies, But the state doesn't have the ability to ensure that today. You need companies and you need regulations in this state to ensure that companies invest in responsible gaming. And you don't have those protections right now in the state of Georgia. I can tell you as the person who helped write our rules for the Sports Wagering Council in Tennessee, it was critical to us to make sure that each of our operators, each of our licensees took responsible gaming seriously. I'm proud today to stand on behalf of Underdog because we've invested $1 million of our own money, our shareholders' money, I should say, in a venture capital fund designed to encourage other entrepreneurs who are developing new solutions in responsible gaming to bring those solutions to market for the betterment of the entire industry. Fantasy sports, once upon a time, was 8 of us sitting around a table looking at box scores in a newspaper. Well, we don't have that coffee break table anymore. We don't have newspapers much anymore. The game has changed in many ways, but there is one thing that is still true. The game is still about your wit. It is still about competition. And yes, as 40 years ago in that office in Knoxville, Tennessee, where I worked in the early 1980s, it is about funding, and that is important. It is important on behalf of Underdog's 1.5 million customers nationwide, and for us, 115,000 in the state of Georgia, that all of you take this legislation seriously, craft it, but we also urge you to pass it. Mr. Chairman, I'm grateful for the opportunity. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Mr. Lee. And then our last speaker, Kayla Lott from the Coalition for Fantasy Sports.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So my name is Kayla Lott, and I represent the Coalition for Fantasy Sports. So our coalition proudly serves over 400,000 users in the state of Georgia. So our companies are Prize Picks, who you just heard of earlier, and then Underdog Fantasy, who Tom represents, and then as well as Better. Our coalition is in full support of this regulatory framework that can help Georgia recoup some of the well-deserved tax increases that you guys are missing out on by not having this regulatory framework. And we urge your passage and support.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, that concludes the folks that had signed up to speak. At this time, our posture is we're not going to take action at this point. If you have an amendment or a question for the bill sponsor, I would ask that you get with Chairman Stevens and work with him on that so that when we do come back, at that point, if we do make amendments in committee, at that time we would have those ready to go. Again, we're limited on time here, and so I would just ask that. And then, Mr. Chairman, I'm going to turn it back over to you if you have any final comments for the timing of this. Again, we're under a little bit of pressure here on time.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I look back over this. Every now and then we've got to make a decision. Do we want to plug the holes in Hope and Pre-K? You've got an opportunity coming today or tomorrow to make that decision. I sat right here and watched folks sit in those 2 chairs in another hearing and say point blank they want to eliminate gambling in Georgia, all gaming. Ladies and gentlemen, that kills the lottery. And the 4.1 million Georgians that had the opportunity to pull themselves up and get a better life was brought on in 1992 whenever we started the lottery. Then there was nothing more than a paper lottery ticket. Today we're asking you to accept the revenue of games that are already going on. You're going to have to make a decision. Do you want to kill the lottery? Do you want to fully fund Hope? Or you do want to capture the revenue and for the first time regulate this industry that's going on today? And with that, Mr. Chairman, I'll leave and we'll go to rules.
All right, thank you. So at this point, we're dismissed, and we will be in touch with you when we schedule the next meeting.